Okay, you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, or on our website, www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHWWPPM. Tonight on the program, we'll be joined by two council members, Cindy Bass and Isaiah Thomas, reflecting on the city council session that just ended. Also discussing budget and other issues. And after we have our interviews, we will discuss the recent Supreme Court cases and the effects that they could have on Philadelphia. So what we'd like to do is lead off with our interview with Councilmember Cindy Bass. And I just want to preface it by saying we recorded this interview last Thursday, I believe, and it was before the Roe versus Wade decision came down, the Dobbs decision came down from the Supreme Court. So we didn't ask about it in the interview, and that's why. Our interview with Councilmember Thomas, which we conducted on Monday, we do discuss it with him. We talk about it at the end of the interview. So that's why it's not in the Cindy Bass interview. So here's our interview with Councilmember Cindy Bass.
Good evening, and we're back with more of Hall Monitor here on WPPM 106.5. I'm Denise Clay Murray, and I'm joined by my co-host Larry McGlynn, and we're joined by Cindy Bass, councilwoman for the 8th Councilmanic District, which includes like Germantown Avenue and places like Mount Airy and stuff, places that you go north and you check them out. And we wanted to have you on to talk a little bit about the most recent budget cycle, because, you know, as we're recording this, council has just finished its last meeting for the year.
Yes.
And we wanted to find out from you, you know, just whether or not you think that council did everything it had to do this year, and what's next for you in terms of next year and over the summer. So I guess my first question for you, over the last week or so, we have heard you talk about rebuild and
Yes.
what it's not necessarily doing in terms of recreation centers, not only for the city, but specifically for your district. Has that been straightened out at all, and does that reflect in this budget?
Well, it has been reflected in this budget. There's been some additions made that would make the 8th district whole, but it's a start. I want to just say that for sure. It's not the finish. And for those who may not be aware, this matter came to light last week when we had a hearing with the executive director of Rebuild and asked for the umpteenth time what was the spending per district, because Rebuild started out as a $500 million program, and along the way that's shrunken down to 425. But if you divide that by 10 districts, that's $42.5 million per district, and that's kind of the way we had assumed it was going to be spent, but we wanted to be sure that everyone was getting their fair share. We knew that some districts, particularly along sort of like the river wards, Fishtown, Northern Liberties, parts of South Philadelphia, East of Broad, and Northeast Philadelphia, Bridesburg, so all those kinds of communities, which have historically had, you know, higher levels of investment by the city, didn't need as much. And then you have sort of like the rest of the city, primarily Black and brown neighborhoods that had a significant need. And so the question was, when it came to light that we were receiving so much less funding than everyone else, why is that, and who made these decisions, and what was the decision-making process? So, you know, we've you know, we're on a path to have a fair funding for the 8th district. But we still need to answer those questions as to how did we even arrive here in the first place, that my district will receive $20 to $30 million less than comparable districts. You know, that's a question that still has not been asked by the administration. And I did say in the hearing before we passed the resolution out of committee on Tuesday that, you know, if we don't have those answers, you know, I don't want to hold anything up. But at the same time, the people, the citizens, the taxpayers deserve an answer to how these decisions are being made.
Now, what are you hearing from your constituents when it comes to the recreation centers in your district?
Listen, whether it's my district or throughout the city, for the most part, people are very unhappy with the conditions. People feel that these are substandard conditions. They haven't been addressed in decades, not years, decades, plural on the end there, S on the end. And so the rebuild, we were all very excited when the idea came along that we were going to have new recreation centers and playgrounds and libraries and this and that and the other. But, a fairness is important. Equity is important. Making these decisions in a way that's really going to, lift the entire city is the right thing to do. And I have to say, citywide, I got a lot of support throughout the entire city. I got support from people who work within the city, within the Department of Parks and Recreation, and who are working on these projects. I got support all around the city of Philadelphia with people saying, you're doing the right thing and keep going, because what has happened is totally unfair, and they got it. They got it, and they got it immediately, that, the way this money was divvied up was not appropriate.
Now, when we talk about the city's gun violence issue, which is still top of mind for a lot of people, one of the suggestions that's always made or often made is that we provide more for kids to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that means more programs, like job programs, more recreation programs, more of that kind of thing. In the committee that you chair, the Parks and Recreation Committee, are you all talking about about gun violence from that perspective? And if so, what is it that you would like to see done?
Well, obviously, we would like to see a lot more programming in our recreation centers and in our libraries and the playgrounds, and working with Parks and Rec is critically important. I have great relationships with all of the rec center leaders in my district, but at the same time, through the administration, some of these centers aren't open. They're not open in the amount of hours that they need to be open. They need to be open almost around the clock. And when I say almost around the clock, they need to open at 7 or 8 in the morning until 9 or 10 o'clock at night. I know we just put a new curfew in, so whatever the new curfew hour is, I think it's 10 o'clock. But those recreation centers and playgrounds need to be open and fully staffed for all of those hours. The other part to crime and violence, though, and I do want to pivot just a little bit into something that we've been working on in my office, which is sort of like a public service campaign around guns in the home and the age of these shooters. Our campaign is called, "What do you do when the shooter lives with you?" And so the idea behind that is that a lot of these shooters, a lot of these victims, a lot of people who are involved in this deadly game of gunplay are minors. And so they're young. Those who aren't minors are still young. They're 18, 19, 20, 21, early 20s. They're living at home. They're not apartment dwellers on their own or homeowners. They live with someone. And so we say that, parents, guardians, caregivers, whoever, we need for you to go in that room, as we call it, run that room, flip up that mattress, look in that closet. When I was growing up at my mother's house, there was no such thing as privacy at all. And so we need for parents to jump in there and say, listen, I'm going to do what I need to do to save my child's life or keep them out of jail and save somebody else's child's life. And so we need to figure out ways that we can get more engaged, get more parents, more caregivers engaged into addressing that issue, because again, they're living with somebody. These guns are being hidden in homes, and we need action.
So, and that's a good point that you're making about the fact that there are people living among these folks with the guns, but that's been the case for a while. How do we get parents or brothers and sisters or friends to say, I know that you did something with this gun and I know that that's wrong and I need to talk to the police about it. How do you get to that? How do we get past the snitches get stitches point?
Well, if it's your parent, your caregiver, your grandparents you're living with, then, listen, what I'm suggesting is some things you can handle at home. And you don't want to call the police. Listen, if I go in a room and I see my 18-year-old son has a gun stuffed under his mattress, I don't want to call the police. I don't want to get the police involved. I want to handle it outside of calling the police on my child, having them go into the system, maybe having them incarcerated. I want to figure out how can I handle that. So that's what this campaign is really going to be all about getting them the tools and the information to help you handle a situation that is happening in your home with a young person who lives in your home. Keep them out of the system as much as possible and keep them away from, like I said, that deadly gunplay that's claiming so many lives here in the city of Philadelphia.
Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Larry. Larry, you got any questions?
Thank you, Denise. Councilmember, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
So the city budget has been finalized. Are you satisfied with how it turned out? And what are you looking at as big successes in this budget?
Well, let me just say this. I think when you look at this budget and when you look at the city's way of budgeting, we've been, in my opinion, overtaxing for years. And you see that in the end result, where every year we project that we're going to end up with, let's say, $50 million in the fund balance, and we end up with $150 million or $200 million or $300 million, and it's year in and year out. I don't have the exact figure in front of me, but I believe in the Kenney administration, we've had an extra, I'll say, close to $1 billion, like $900 million or something like that, over the last 6-7 years or whatever it's been. And so that's a lot of money. That says to me that we are overtaxing the citizens of the city of Philadelphia. And so I do see that the cuts to the wage tax, to the BERT tax, the efforts to reduce the impact of the assessments, real estate assessments, I see those as wins so that we don't continue the overtaxation. But I still think that the amount that we did add in taxes with those assessments is problematic. There's going to be some repercussions to that. We do know that there are some people who are not going to be able to afford, the increases. There has been conversation among council about the creation of a fund. We'll see how that works. That's yet to be seen yet. I'm not a big, fan of it. If we can slash the tax in a way that just makes sense up front, then I would say let's just do that. Let's just do what makes sense, what's easy to understand, and what doesn't require folks who may not be as savvy or be, have internet access or whatever the process is going to be that you have to navigate to be able to access those funds to help you save your home in that $10 million pot. We know that there's going to be some people who are going to be lost in the sauce and not able to access those funds or that program. So I say, let's do what makes sense. Let's do what's right. Let's do what's easy for our constituents and the taxpayers. And it's yet to be seen if that's what will result as from this program.
And the last thing I'd like to ask you about, a couple weeks ago, you put up a resolution talking about the Atwater Kent Museum. And that's something we covered here on the show literally the week before you did that. So it's interesting. What do you think is likely to happen now in this process?
So we've gotten a lot of conversation from folks from the Drexel University side, from the advocate and activist community. And so what we've done is we're going to bring those folks together. So in early July, we're bringing everybody to the table. Our office is going to be there, sort of like making sure that things are done in a way that makes sense. We think we can do that. We think that, we can get all the parties there. Drexel University, which is going to really be the responsible party, the big party that's going to be responsible in all of this, has given us the signal that they are going to be working closely with the activist community. We're going to be there to oversee that and make sure that, the valuable treasures are not going to just be discarded. And I think that that's really what the fear is. That's really what the concern is. As they say, one man's trash is another man's treasure. So just because it may not have any value to me, it may be super valuable to you. And we're going to make sure that those feelings are respected.
Okay, I'd like to turn it back over to Denise Clay Murray.
I have one final question for
Sure.
you. And it's kind of a question that we ask as a standard question around here because we see that the 2023 mayor's race is already starting to heat up. And
I can guess this question, can I?
so because you've been bandied about as one of the people that's considering making a run for the office. Are you still thinking about that?
Well, as you know, I cannot say what my thoughts are, which way I'm leaning, but I will tell you that I love the work that I do. I'm born and raised in the city. I love the city, and I want to see it do better, and I think it can do better. So whether I'm here in council or in another position, I'm going to work hard for the citizens, and I'm going to fight for them all the way.
Okay, thank you. We really appreciate your time, Council Member Cindy Bass. Thank you for sharing some time with us. And we'll be back with more of Hall Monitor in a moment.
Thank you.
Okay, we would like to thank Councilmember Cindy Bass for being with us on the program. And I would like to introduce the person you just saw, co-host Denise Clay Murray. Denise, how are you tonight?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. That question, are you thinking about running for mayor? It seems like they're all ready for it. They all have an answer for that.
Well, hey, at least we know they're reading the papers, right?
Yeah.
Because that is like, the fact that Cindy Bass is one of the people on the list of people that are allegedly thinking of running for mayor, that's kind of like the worst kept secret in town. I even wrote about it about 3 or 4 months ago for City and State PA for a power list that they did. So, it's not like people haven't been talking about it for a while. Thing is, this summer is where folks are going to start really formulating a plan about whether or not they're going to do it, because this is the time when you got to start raising the money, because you got to resign under the city charter to run for mayor if you're on city council or if you're in any row office. So all of the people that you keep hearing about, the Rebecca Reinhardts, the Derek Green, Cindy Bass, Sherelle Parker, Alan Dom, all of those, Helen Gim, all of those people have to make some sort of a decision as early as possible, because you got to start raising money to put your ducks in a row, because the campaign starts.
Right. And Dom and Reinhardt have actually taken a step farther by putting out emails and things saying they are seriously considering it, which is about as far as you can go. You're right up at that line before you'd have to resign your current office. And I expect that we'll see more of that in the coming weeks and months. So.
Yeah. And the thing is, just to give some of the benefit of the stuff that I see, when I'm out in my travels, some of those folks really need to think very, very hard about whether or not they want to give up their job as an elected official and to give up what they're doing now to take a shot at an office they may not really have a shot at.
Right. Because remember,
go ahead.
Well, you're talking about maybe half a dozen members of council, although I don't think that many will at this point, but it could happen, right? So let's say 4 members of council resign to run, and also the city controller. That's 5 big time offices.
Oh yeah.
That will not have their person in there.
Right.
So to me, it's a huge step, and you have to feel very confident that you could win the nomination if you're going to do that. Giving up a council, that's tough.
Ahead. And another thing
it's tough to do, yeah.
Well, another thing that might impact that process is whether or not Council President Darrell Clark decides either to run for re-election or to step down. The rumor is that he's talking about stepping down, because I think it's just no longer, it's ceasing to be fun for him, for want of a better way to put it. In that case, then a lot of the people that we've been talking about have to make a decision as to whether or not they want to be mayor of Philadelphia and have to have, people like you and me ask them nosy questions all the time, or whether they want to be city council president and be able to, still get those nosy questions, but be able to defer to someone else for the bigger answers. I mean, Darrell Clark may have the cream pie thrown at him, but he also has the room to duck and let the mayor take it in the face.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
some of these folks are going to ask themselves, do I want to be the person that the cream pie is aimed at, or the person that gets hit with the cream pie?
And whenever I think about a position like mayor, and to a certain extent city council president as well, I always remember the John F. Kennedy quote about being president, and it's analogous. He said, being president means you get the toughest problems nobody else could figure out.
Mhm.
And I think that's very much the same as being mayor and city council president.
Right.
A lot of the other things are taken care of by people below you. They never get to you because they're not the kind of issue that needs your attention. You
Mhm.
get the biggest problems, and it's institutional knowledge, intelligence, and a certain amount of creativity that makes you effective, I guess. Plus circumstance. We have to be honest about that. Not every politician is given the same hand to play economically, no matter what. Not always fair, but still, you're expected to produce.
Right.
And I don't think I would want to be that person who is dealing with the biggest problems, because it's just an incredibly difficult thing to do, and you're a lightning rod. But we're gonna see. There's a long way to go. There's a long way to
Right.
go.
I mean, let's be honest. Jim Kenney started out his term as mayor as a relatively happy guy. He was happy to get the job. He didn't mind going to do the Eagles parade. He started out as a relatively happy guy. Now, I have never seen anyone so anxious for a job to come to an end before in my life. I mean, I think that once this man is no longer mayor, you're not going to see him for a while. And that's going to be because if he doesn't have to, he's not going to deal with any of the ceremonial stuff that you have to deal with as mayor of Philadelphia. He's just not. But the race actually started with the last council session, if we're honest with ourselves. So
Yes,
we'll just
yes.
have to see what shakes out.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. So we have another interview we're going to play with Council Member Isaiah Thomas. We talk a lot about things that happened this session and some things that may happen in the future. So here's our interview with Council Member Isaiah Thomas. All right, Council Member Isaiah Thomas, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to join you and talk a little politics.
Great. So the first thing I'd like to talk to you about, we had a very busy council session, especially at the end there. And council passed some tax cuts to the wage tax and the BERT tax. Can you tell us, your rationale for supporting those tax decreases and what you think the benefit to the city will be?
Sure. So I think two different reasons for supporting each of the taxes. I think wage first and foremost. When we looked at the pandemic and we looked at the impact that the pandemic had financially on the city of Philadelphia, if you didn't believe it before, that was the evidence that showed that we rely way too much on our wage tax. When you think about the big cities all across the country and the type of hit they took during the pandemic, the only city to lose more revenue than the city of Philadelphia was Detroit. And so as folks who are responsible for passing and balancing a good budget, responsible for thinking about the fiscal viability of the city, I thought it was important that we move in a direction, especially as we see real estate assessments going up, that we move in a direction when we get the opportunity to rely as little on our wage tax as we possibly can. I'm not saying that revenue isn't important and is needed. We need as much revenue as we can as the city of Philadelphia, but at the same time, that specific experience as it relates to governing during the pandemic and watching the impact of relying so much on the wage tax could have on us, I thought that was important, and I thought it was something that we needed to do. So I was happy to be a part and to help lead that fight. When it comes to the bird tax, I think that's a totally different conversation. The way we tax businesses, especially small businesses in the city of Philadelphia, is one where, as though when you look at what the coronavirus crisis created as it relates to the ability to work from home, as it relates to a competing market, and trying to do our best to not just attract businesses, but to maintain the businesses that we have, I thought it was important that we send a signal that Philadelphia is open for business and we want to do things that's in the best interest of all of our constituents. And so for two separate reasons, I thought it was two important votes that we had to take. And if we are thinking about the future of our city, thinking about the anticipated deficit that we have, not just on the municipal side, but as well as on the school district side, we have to be innovative in what we do. We have to think about those things years in advance and come up with proactive plans to put us in a position to assure that we're providing the best services and the best quality of life experiences for the city of Philadelphia.
So the wage tax cut is probably going to cost the city about $20.5 million in revenue next fiscal year. We're not exactly sure how much the bird tax cut will cost. However, the savings for citizens is relatively modest. The wage tax decrease will save the average Philadelphian between $15 and $20 a year. The bird tax, if a company makes about $1 million a year, will be about $30. So when we look at the revenue that we're taking away, how do we make that up when it seems like every dollar counts?
I don't think that we're in a position to essentially have to look at the revenue and ask, how do we make it up? We have plenty of revenue right now. We had a $5.6 anticipated $1 billion budget prior to real estate assessments coming out. So we have an opportunity to be innovative and creative as it relates to the revenue that we have right now. You're talking about government services, things like parks and rec centers, libraries, and things of that capacity. It takes those departments years to staff up to the point that we want them to be. So when we're fighting for rec centers to be open on weekends, which is something that was a huge priority to me, there's only but so much money we can give them in Class 100. One of the issues that we have is the Great Resignation. The city of Philadelphia is suffering from that as well too. So when we look at Class 100 spending, not only are we going to have revenue left as we close out this fiscal year and move into the fall, we'll have revenue left, but we will also we'll have revenue left in Class 100. But a lot of our estimates as it relates to anticipated revenue for the final quarters of this year are pretty conservative. So we are pretty optimistic that we will be able to do even more things this fall with some transfer ordinances. And we're confident that we can be able to survive the tax cuts that we recommended without necessarily putting us in a position to have to worry about the revenue being made up. Again, the wage tax cut wasn't necessarily about just putting money in the citizens' pockets. We always want to try to put money in people's pockets when we can, especially when we have a surplus of revenue. But I think more importantly, what it was about was beginning to shift the burden, or continuing. I shouldn't say beginning because it's already been happening before I got here. Continuing to shift the burden as it relates to our reliance on the wage tax, to rely on other taxes besides something that can easily move to the county or to the other side of the Commonwealth, and to Jersey or Delaware. When we think about the bird tax, I think that was us as a municipality trying to send a signal that Philadelphia is open for business. So it's not just about the revenue, because at the end of the day, when you talk about a huge cut that would have that type of impact on constituents or on businesses, that type of revenue will be hard to make up. When you talk about these cuts, again, on the wage side, the focus is to continue to shift our reliance away from wage, because the way we rely on it and how much we rely on it is fiscally dangerous. And the bird tax is to send a signal that Philadelphia is open for business. This is the first time bird has been below 6.0 in decades. So at the end of the day, it's we can do more revenue. We would, but unfortunately, like you said, we don't want to put us in a position where we're cutting services or not being able to provide the best quality of life experiences that we can afford to as a city.
And shifting the burden away from the wage tax, particularly, has been a goal of the administration since they were sworn in. It's something that they've been looking to do. But
we support. We think it's the right thing to do. And again, folks who are critical of that theory, I think the pandemic showed you that we do rely too much on our wage checks, and it puts us in a position in a changing economy and a global economy and a world that's constantly changing as it relates to technology. People are beginning to work from anywhere. So if from a fiscal perspective, Philadelphia isn't working for them, and from a quality of life perspective, Philadelphia isn't working for them, they can easily relocate. We have to begin to do our part as it relates to local government to let people know that Philadelphia is open for business, and this is a great place to start, grow, and allow your business to mature.
Right, and the wage tax is incredibly volatile. Like you said, we saw that during the pandemic. How challenging that can be. Even if you have a recession, even a minor recession, you see hits in that wage tax and hits to the revenue. Long term, if we're trying to move away from the wage tax, trying to reduce the business taxes, where do you see city revenue coming from once we, because we know we have a little bit of a surplus with the federal funds that came in, but that has to be allocated by 2024 and spent by 2026. So long term, 10, 15, 20 years from now, where do you see the city's main sources of revenue coming from?
I think that we are going to see a combination of real estate taxes. We will continue to rely on the wage tax. We'll always have businesses paying bird tax, but we also have a number of other different taxes that we have, from use of occupancy to transfer taxes. Like, those things are going to stay in place. We're not saying that we want to get rid of all of the taxes. We're saying that the balance and the structure that we have right now is not necessarily ideal. It's not fiscally responsible. So I think that when you start to see that we use the $80,000 exemption for homestead, that might not always be there. There might be a time when homestead is reduced back down to maybe a $70,000 exemption. We don't necessarily know what the future is going to look like. We can see big increases as it relates to appraisals, and maybe go up to 90,000 as it relates to the homestead exemption. I'm not quite sure, but what we know is we need more of a balance as it relates to real estate taxes, wage taxes, as well as business taxes. And right now, we're relying heavily on wage and not as much on our real estate taxes. So I think that that's going to shift. I think that you're going to see some innovation as it relates to ways that we can generate revenue for the city. And that's the direction I think that we'll go in.
So talking about property taxes and the reassessments that had just occurred, it was a little bit surreal on May 9th when the property taxes were released, and OPA, the Office of Property Assessment, was in their budget hearing, and in real time, council members were saying, I just got an email from a constituent about their increase being like 50%. Right. Everybody was very surprised by the scope of these increases. So, and City Council did a lot towards the end of the session. You had mentioned homestead, changes to the loop program, other things that I think are helpful. Do you think for the time being that's it, or are there other strategies that you favor that could reduce the economic impact of property assessments on Philadelphians?
I mean, this is similar to your other question. It's so hard to say because the market is so unpredictable right now. And I think that's why we're trying to give ourselves as many options as possible as city government, so that no matter what direction the market shifts in, folks are talking about a deeper recession coming next year. We're fiscally in a position to be able to take the hit and put us in hopefully a stable condition as it relates to how we come on the other side of whatever fiscal uncertainty is happening over the next year or so. I mean, it's not just COVID, right? We have the war happening in Ukraine. We have inflation, which is, all these things are impacting one another. And it makes it a little hard for us to really predict exactly what that tax balance is going to be as we move forward, and how the real estate market will be impacted by all of this stuff. The assessments this year, when we look at it, the appraisals were not necessarily based on today's market value. It was actually based on last year. So if you look at the impact that inflation has had, we can see a significant increase again, depending on how the assessments are done, because that's another big question is, a lot of folks are wondering, including myself, exactly how these assessments are done. But we could see another big increase for residents in a number of parts of the city. And that can put us in a position where we need more protections for our homeowners, because the one thing we don't want to do is push people out of their home. Philadelphia is a city of neighborhoods. We are a city of homeowners. And that is something that we want to continue to promote and support. So whatever we have to do to try to protect homeowners, that's always going to be a priority to myself and my colleagues. And we're going to do everything in our power to be able to do that. It's just hard to predict exactly what direction we're going to go in. But again, I think our goal is to have as many options as possible. And I think that's why you see some of the tax cuts that you heard suggested, because we did do a good job of putting a lot of revenue into things to address city government related issues and city services, resources and programs, but we still have revenue left over. So what better message to send to the constituents of Philadelphia as well as the surrounding area that Philadelphia is open for business. When you look at the issue of poverty, when you look at our job growth and our job market, we're one of the cities that continue to grow low income wage jobs. Like, we want to be able to grow jobs that put people in a position where they can live a quality middle class life. Far too often, people who work and live in the city of Philadelphia are the working poor. When we say, about 25% of our city is living in poverty, a lot of those folks got a job. They wake up and go to work every day. They're just not being able to put in a position where they can earn a quality living for themselves and their family. Hence the term working poor.
And one thing you said that I wholeheartedly agree with is the concern over what the next assessments are going to look like. If OPA is committed to doing these every year, which maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't for next year. I mean, I anecdotally, I can tell you that houses in my neighborhood that sold for significantly higher than what they would have a year or two ago were not taken into account in this assessment.
Exactly.
So next year, you could see, or in 2 years, the same situation again, which is very troubling. Let's shift gears a little bit here. This is your third budget cycle in City Council. What observations do you have regarding that process? And is there anything you can illuminate, our listeners in terms of how the budget gets from beginning to end?
So it's been 3 different budgets for me. My first budget process was a mess because that was the first year of COVID. Last year, we were thinking about and during that year, we were thinking about what we had to cut and what we had to give up, and how could we basically put a Band-Aid budget together to be able to survive all the things that we were going through. Last year, we started to see a little light towards the end of the tunnel as it relates to budget negotiations. But I think this was our first budget where we actually had money, where we can actually advocate for program services and not just for things to be saved, but for things to invest in. This was the first budget for me that we could be proactive. Every year before this, it was very much reactive. And so at the end of the day, first and foremost, is always about the revenue. And the revenue this time was very uncertain because of property assessments. But we knew that we would have a surplus thanks to the federal dollars and the federal support. People did not understand how important that federal support was. To put us in a position where we didn't have to take a vote to increase taxes, because if we didn't get federal money, not only would we not been able to cut taxes, we probably would have had to take a vote at some point to increase some tax somewhere, similar to what we had to do with the parking tax when we first hit the COVID crisis. So at the end of the day, the budget process is a process that consists of a lot of work, a lot of research, a lot of hearings, a lot of dialogue, a lot of negotiation, and a lot of listening to constituents and to advocate groups to understand what people are going through, what issues we're facing as a municipality, and what can we do as government to essentially allocate dollars or resources to be able to address the ills that people communicate to us on a consistent basis. I think for myself as a freshman, this was my best budget cycle because, again, I wasn't necessarily fighting for things to be saved. I was fighting for investments. And we were able to get a lot of wins, whether it was investing in democracy as it relates to what we did with the city commissioner's office and increasing their funding, investing in our children, whether it be programs, parks, rec centers, or St. Christopher Hospital, as well as investing in constituents across the city as it relates to some of the things we were able to do around taxes, some of the things we were able to do to protect homeowners, and some of the things that we were able to do to provide better government services. So at the end of the day, I'm very proud of what we were able to accomplish, but I recognize that we still have a lot more work to do as it relates to everyday issues citizens of Philadelphia are facing, whether it's gun violence or other criminal activity, as well as the future of our city, thinking about our pension fund, the deficit that that we anticipate when federal dollars run out, as well as issues related to our schools, infrastructure dollars for our schools, and their anticipated deficit in a couple of years. So, we can do a short victory lap for maybe a couple of days right now, but at the end of the day, we got a lot of work to do this summer, as well as preparing for the future of our city.
So just using this budget as an example, how much do you think changes between the time the mayor gives his budget address and the time you take that final vote in the budget? How much, I don't know if you have a dollar number on how much money gets changed around, but what do you think that is in terms of the percentage of things that gets changed, or what that really looks like?
I think most things get changed, and I think the mayor and his budget proposal leaves enough wiggle room to be able to allow those negotiations to happen. When you look at a lot of the things that I named already, a lot of those things started off on $1 amount, and through budget negotiations, as well as looking at the dollars that we anticipate coming in from the increased property assessments, it's more revenue there than what was there when the mayor did his budget proposal. So at the end of the day, because of the increase in revenue, because his proposal didn't spend every single dollar, because of the revenue left over from Class 100, just because we're not hiring at the way that we budgeted for, we know we have dollars to be creative with. So at the end of the day, we've seen a significant amount of change as it relates to when the mayor first gave his budget proposal to where we ended up as it related to last week's vote. I would say I don't want to give it like a percentage or a number, because I can't say for certain, but it was significant. Even the wage tax number that we landed on, the idea around Byrd, what we did with St. Chris, what we did with the commissioner's office, what we did with the public defender's office, what we did in investing in services, what we did around L&I. A lot of change, programs that we put money into that wasn't originally on the mayor's budget. We've seen huge change, and it was a lot of negotiation that took place, a lot of hearings behind the scenes to put us in a position to be able to pass this budget.
Okay. And it always seemed to me that poverty and violence are inextricably linked. And we get through this budget session. Are there any things in this budget that particularly excites you about the idea, being able to reduce poverty and violence? Is there anything that really stands out for you?
When I think about like poverty and violence specifically, I think that some of the things that we're trying to do as it relates to tax structure will look at some of the issues related to poverty. I think what we're trying to do around work, what we're trying to do around public-private partnerships, you see it with the arts and culture sector, the Illuminate the Arts grants, and some of the initiatives that the private sector has done to merit that. You'll see more initiatives coming down the pipe because we've done another round of Illuminate the Arts grants. So again, getting that support from the private sector. I think leading by example, being a part of the negotiations to be able to bring folks together. I think that this budget has put us in a position to begin to take steps as it relates to poverty in the city of Philadelphia. We did earmark a lot of dollars towards gun violence, but the gun violence problem is going to require more than money. And at the end of the day, as government, money and allocation of dollars is our primary responsibility. And outside of that, as individual people, we have to do as much as we can. And that's what I plan on doing with my time, not just this summer, but moving forward, just trying my best to continue to invest in young people so that we can ensure that we're giving them as much prevention-based initiatives and opportunities as possible. And I think that's one of the areas that we were successful at in this budget. Before, we talked a lot about intervention programs, and intervention is great. And when you look at how the Office of Gun Violence Prevention has allocated those grant dollars, most of that money is going to intervention-based initiatives. This budget, we invested in prevention-based initiatives. When you listen to some of the stories that young people tell about how they got involved in criminal activity, far too often it starts with them being bored. So at the end of the day, we put more money into prevention-based initiatives in this budget than what we've done since I've been a member of City Council. So I wouldn't say excited. I'm glad that we're doing what's right. Clearly, we've had fiscal issues in the past, but some of these things should have already been done. But at the end of the day, again, we still have more work to do. So I'm going to continue to fight the fight against poverty, continue to work with our state partners. I think that that's something I pride myself in, working with our state partners to figure out what can we do around partnering to be able to address issues like the minimum wage, to be able to figure out what can we do as far as providing regulatory relief for businesses, continue to advocate for bills like my Keep It Local bill, where government is doing our part and making sure that we're investing in local businesses. And I think that we had some wins this budget, but I do think we have a lot more work to do. This was just a small step, and we're going to have to take some bigger steps moving forward. And I hope people are going to be open to some of the ideas and the recommendations that we have as it relates to generating revenue for the city, as well as addressing nuisance-related issues that impact the quality of life in the city of Philadelphia.
I'm glad you mentioned the Illuminate the Arts grants, because and that's been an issue for you. One of the things that people, whenever there's an economic recession, the first thing that sort of gets put on the chopping block are things like the arts and the people who create art. And if we're in a city that is marketing itself as an artistic city, public art and things like that, you can't get rid of that, and you can't tell the people who are making those things you're not important anymore. So I think that was incredibly important, and something that always has to be considered. So what I'd like to do, switch gears a little bit here. This is not necessarily in City Council purview, but the Supreme Court has made some, to put it politely, controversial rulings, including one today, particularly concerning abortion and gun ownership. What are your reactions to some of these things we're seeing coming out of the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely disappointing, but not surprising. And at the end of the day, I think not only are the rulings disappointing, I think the response that we're seeing from people is also disappointing. I'm just, all of the finger pointing, all of the blaming, such and such should have did this, such and such should have did that. This person should have stepped down. This person should have fought harder. Look, at the end of the day, we know how we got here. And, one of the things that is important in government is to hold people accountable for the decisions that they make. So the folks who decided to put these Supreme Court justices here, they told us this was going to happen. When they campaigned, when they ran for office, this is what they said they were going to do. And at the end of the day, this is the outcome. We talk often about the Trump presidency, and we said that, the Trump term will last way longer than his time as president, right? And we all knew that when he, got the opportunity to appoint record number of judges, federal judges, up and down. So at the end of the day, we can't now act surprised because this, we knew this was going to happen. But I think the disappointing thing is blaming people who, like blaming President Obama or blaming former sitting judges, or, that's not it. That's the disappointing side to me. I think I would like to see some folks who are disappointed in the decisions that have been made to show the same level of unification, the same level of unity, the same level of intentionality as it relates to being strategic, right? Like folks fought this for, half a century to get to this point. And they now got to where they want. And those of us who believe in this are, within a week of the decision, already pointing fingers at each other. And I know the natural phases of trauma, says that there's this phase of shock before you could come to rational thinking. But I think that the response that we're seeing in the midst of the phase of shock is putting people in a position that they're saying things and doing things that's beyond repair. And I think that's the part that's concerning, is that we're becoming so divisive that it could possibly put us in a position where we could see more damage. I'll give you an example. I coach high school basketball, and often what I tell young people is, and it's a life lesson, don't let one mistake turn into two. Yeah, you may have missed the layup, but you're so disappointed that you missed the layup that you didn't get back on defense, and now the other team gets an open three-pointer. So, life is the same way. Yeah, we lost this one, but we can't be so upset and so disappointed that the internal fighting puts us in a position where now we lose the midterms in November, right? And now what hurt us so much has been put on steroids, because you'll have states like Pennsylvania where Republicans will have control, and they'll be able to double down on the Supreme Court decisions that they've made. And it's been multiple decisions that they'll be able to double down on if we are in a position in November where we're not electing Josh Shapiro or not electing John Fetterman and Austin Davis. Like, these elections are important. They have consequences. And I hope that people are not so upset that they decide to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Voting, especially if you're a young person, has been something that hasn't shown you a direct result like you may have wanted it to. And if you are a young person and you have voted, let's say 5 or 6 times since 2016 or so, maybe 7 or 8 times since 2000. Well, actually, no, I take that back. More like 15 or 16 times, because we want you to vote twice a year, every year. You voted, in all these elections, and you look up and you feel like things are worse now, today, than what they were when you started voting. How is it that we can continue to keep those young people inspired, motivated, and believing in democracy? Because at the end of the day, that's a tough perspective from that lived experience, to be able to wake up on a consistent basis and often see that your vote didn't make the difference that you wanted it to make. So we got a lot of work to do. I am worried. The decisions, they are harmful, they're painful, they're alarming, and they're creating a backlash that, to me, is concerning. But I'm prepared to organize and try my best to lead. I'm not going to just sit on the sideline and allow chaos to happen. I consider myself a leader, a thought leader in the city of Philadelphia, an elected leader, not just in Philadelphia, but across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And, my goal is to fight as hard as we can to make sure that we're successful in November, and we're as united as a Democratic Party. And those of us who, from an ideological perspective, are disturbed by these decisions that have come out recently, that we're united and we're fighting the same fight, and not pointing and blaming folks who didn't have a direct impact on us.
Councilmember Isaiah Thomas, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Larry, for having me, and please tell Denise I missed her this time.
And Denise, and we'd like to thank Councilmember Isaiah Thomas for being with us on the program, as always. Now, Denise, I'd like to kind of ask you the same question there I asked Councilmember Thomas. We see these Supreme Court rulings happening.
Mm-hmm.
What are we to think? What are we to do?
I've kind of been asking myself this question since some of the court's earlier rulings in their term. Things like no longer being allowed to sue the police for not reading you your Miranda warning. And the fact that if you put gun laws on the books and you want to, have more gun regulation, they've pretty much given the gun more right than the people who you might be carrying it around. It used to be that the idea was that the judicial branch of our government was supposed to serve as a check and a balance to the other two branches, the executive and the legislative. Their job was to keep either from going too far. And throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s, you used to hear these cries from particularly right-wing Republicans that such decisions as the Voting Rights Act, Brown versus Board of Education, the Lawrence Free Texas, all of these decisions that expanded the rights that you had under the Constitution, like Roe v. Wade and others, those were all considered judicial activism by the right. But what you're seeing now is full-on judicial legislation. I have a column that's running in this week's Philadelphia Sunday Sun, in which I talk about not so much Samuel Alito's decision, his opinion in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Health Services, the case that got rid of Roe v. Wade. I talk about Thomas's concurrence. And in Thomas's concurrence, you have his suggestion that 3 particular cases that have to do with the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, Obergefell v. I think Obergefell v. Hughes, and I know I'm going to mess that up. The decision that allowed for gay marriage. Lawrence v. Texas, the decision that decriminalized sodomy, and Griswold v. Connecticut, the decision that allowed people to be able to use contraception in their homes as a privacy issue. All of those decisions were decided based on the 14th Amendment's due process clause. Thomas thinks that all of those decisions should be revisited, which means if the court decides to go along with his way of thinking, contraception would be re-regulated to the point where if your state decided you shouldn't be able to have it, they could do that. Lawrence v. Texas, and I don't mean to, and I'm going to try to be as ungraphic about this as I possibly can. What Lawrence v. Texas would do, and this is something that heterosexual people, particularly heterosexual men, need to consider. There are some of your favorite behaviors and favorite things you like to do sexually with women that fall under the category of sodomy. And if they are outlawed because Lawrence v. Texas is revisited, guess what? They're outlawed for you too. As for what would happen with Obergefell, there'd be a whole lot of people having to retain lawyers to maintain the rights that they had when they got married under the law, under the Obergefell decision. So what everybody needs to understand, what everybody needs to pay attention to is what people like myself and others who have been following the court and what's happening with it politically have been telling you since 2000. Vote like the court depends on it, because it does. 2000, when George W. Bush became president, that is when you got John Roberts and you got Samuel Alito. 2016, we know what happened there. You got Gorsuch, you got Coney Barrett, you got Kavanaugh and his fondness for beer. You got those 3. 6 out of those 5 justices, plus you add some of the ones that were prior to Bush II, and you've got your 6-3 right there. So everybody needs to understand that if you want to even have a shot at maintaining just some of the rights you already have, you need to pay attention to who is on the Supreme Court, because the Heritage Foundation has had this plan in the works since Roe v. Wade was decided in the 70s. And everybody thought that because it was established law, it would always be thus. But what we all needed to consider is that the people who did not want that to happen in the first place had kids. And guess what they told them?
And I completely echo that point. And, how long has Clarence Thomas been sitting on that 14th Amendment dissent? Probably since before he was appointed.
Oh, yeah. And also, when you look at Obergefell and Lawrence v. Texas, he was one of the dissents on both of those decisions. So, of course, he wants them revisited. But you know the one he doesn't want revisited? Loving v. Virginia. And that's because his insurrectionist wife would probably get really mad if he revisited that.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. We want to thank everybody for joining us this week on Hall Monitor, and we will see you next week.